Hey folks, welcome to Roll of Law. Today I want to talk about my favorite cantrip, which is Minor Illusion. Personally, when I'm making a character, I like to optimize them for what I think is going to be fun, both for myself and other people at the table, as opposed to pure combat effectiveness. And while Minor Illusion does have some combat applications, which is nice, it's also a spell that has such a wide range of potential uses that it creates all sorts of possibilities for circumstances that are either entertaining for yourself and other people at the table, or a circumstance where you can really flex your creative muscles. This is really a good spell for kind of out of the box problem solving, so long as your DM is somebody who's inclined to play ball with that. So I really like this spell. It's one that I will take almost always if I'm playing a character who can cast it, and unless I've got a really good reason not to. Maybe it doesn't fit with this character, but it's one I really like. It's available to almost all arcane casters, and not just arcane casters. There are a few other casters who can get it. It's found in the player's handbook, and I'm not going to read it to you, but just sort of touching on some of the key points. It's got a casting time of 1 action, so fairly quick. It's got a range of 30 feet, although I'm going to put a big asterisk on that because there's ways we can sort of work around that and push that range in certain ways. And the components for what it takes to cast are somatic and material. So what that means is there's no verbal component. You don't have to say anything or use any magic words or anything like that, which means that this spell can be cast quietly. This is fantastic for a lot of applications of Minor Illusion. It does require you to gesture, and it requires that you either have a spellcasting focus or a bit of fleece. Now, a bit of fleece isn't too difficult to get a hold of because you can find this in all sorts of urban settings, and it's something that you can, for instance, work into your clothing without anybody noticing or thinking that that's a problem. So this is something that you can smuggle the component for this into places where you might not otherwise be able to get spell components. For instance, somewhere that's really restrictive and wants to limit your spell casting by taking those things away. The duration on this is 1 minute, although there's nothing saying you can't recast it if you need more illusion for a longer period. So this is actually in some ways 2 spells welded together because it does one of 2 different things. Unless you're an illusionist wizard, in which case you can do both at once, but I'll talk about that a little bit as we go further. So the first thing it allows you to do is to create an image of an object within range, and that image lasts for the full duration of 1 minute, although you can end it earlier if you want, or if you cast the spell again in either version, it'll end the first effect. So you can't sort of layer effects here. Now, an object is important because it means that you can't use this to create images of creatures, for instance. Creatures are not objects. And you can't use this to create multiple objects. You can make a chair, but you can't make 2 chairs facing each other. So that is another limitation as to what you can do on this. That object that you make, if you're making an image of an object, can't be any larger than a 5-foot cube, and it's only visual. It can't make smells, it can't make tastes, if you touch it, your hand will pass right through it, so that'll make it very clear that it's an illusion. And also, it can't be animated or make light in any way. So for instance, if you were to try to make an image of a candle, it would be readily apparent that it's not a real candle because the flame on it can't flicker, and it also can't shed any light. Some other things are kind of questionable, like if you create a mirror. Well, a mirror is a static object, except once you start looking into it and moving around. The best sort of sage advice on this says that this is a static image. It's not specifically noted in the description, but that seems to be the intention. And so something like a mirror would not work. It would look very strange. It would be a mirror that if you look into it, you don't actually see your own reflection. So that might be interesting in and of itself. If somebody sees a mirror and that mirror is weird, that might be something that they investigate and maybe spend a little bit of time looking at, and then maybe the rogue can sneak up on them. But it's probably going to be something that's sort of stands out as unusual, and that usually isn't what you want when you're trying to do this. Now, most of the combat uses for Minor Illusion, you rely on this image of an object thing. And I'm going to cover them really briefly. There's a lot of really good videos on combat uses. Treant Monk has an excellent video on this, so I'm just going to touch on them really quickly. One of them is you can create an object to hide in. A 5-foot cube, if you cast that and then the rogue sits inside of it, well, then other people can't see it. They just see this, a crate or a box or a barrel, and maybe that allows the rogue to make a sneak attack shooting out of it, a surprise attack that is going to be more effective. If you can also potentially just hide behind this object. You can use this to create fake cover, and that cover might impose disadvantage on the opponent's attack. Similarly, if you are hiding behind an illusory cover, they may actually change targets. If they think that you're hiding behind a wall, they might not decide to try to shoot you over the wall or through the wall, but instead switch targets. And if you're the wizard and you're protecting yourself with this is almost always to your benefit. If they're going for you, you have a low armor class and low hit points. You tend to get knocked out easily. Whereas if they instead are shooting the paladin or the fighter or the barbarian, all of those are tougher targets, and that's a net win for the party as a whole. And specifically for you, but for the party as a whole. This is just good group tactics. You might be able to create something that looks like an obstacle or a barrier. If there's, a big rock there, people will probably try to go around that. Now, usually these barriers are going to want to make something that people don't want to touch for various reasons. Maybe a big pile of like really sharp, rusty metal or something like that you really don't want to touch, because if you make something like a table that somebody might try to climb over, they're going to figure out it's an illusion as soon as they try to do that. There's also uses for disengaging. If you can use an illusion to block sight, and an attack of opportunity requires that somebody be able to see you. So this is a potential use for that. Similarly, this might also be able to protect you from spell casting. Now, one thing that people will raise a lot, and this one is kind of questionable in my opinion, but ask your DM. Different DMs have different rulings, and different tables have different sort of cultures and personalities. But this one is to say, listen, you can't create an image of a creature. But what about something like a statue or, I can't make a wolf, but I could make a taxidermied wolf, because now that taxidermied wolf is an object instead of a creature. Okay, well, there is some potential for decoys here, but in most close combats, and Dungeons and Dragons tends to take place a lot in dungeons. It's right there in the name. You're going to see something appear and it's then not going to move. It's not going to snarl at you. It's not going to have any smell. If you're talking about animals, animals might rely heavily on what things smell like. It's just going to sit there. And that might be something that gets you to attack it. But in many cases, you're probably going to go, that's not a threat. I'm going to go after the fighter who's currently swinging a sword at me. That fighter is doing things. The taxidermied wolf is just sitting there being taxidermied. So in many circumstances, I think the advantage or the usefulness of this as a decoy is probably overstated, but not all. If you're, for instance, at long range, you might be able to use this to bait out a few arrows, or even potentially a couple of spells, because at longer range, it might be a lot harder to tell the difference between, a statue or something else. If you think of soldiers, sticking a helmet up on a stick in order to sort of bait a sniper to shoot it, same kind of idea, right? And if you do that enough that's becoming sort of expected, you might make those snipers hesitant to take those shots, because they might say, hey, listen, I don't know if this is a real person or if this is a decoy, especially if you're talking about using magic. They might, instead of using, a high level spell to try to target that, they might instead use cantrips. You've broken up their strategy by messing with their expectations. So all of those are potential uses. I'm going to come back to the images when I sort of go through the sounds aspect, because right now we've covered the combat things. I'm going to get to mischief and how you can be playful with this a little bit later. So the other option for this spell is you can create a sound that originates from a point within 30 feet. Now, it's not clear here in terms of the spell description. It says that the sound emanates from this point, but it's not clear entirely if the sound is only within this area or if it can extend beyond it. Most dungeon masters that I've played with, certainly my own rulings, would be that the sound comes from this point, but at that point is treated like a sound. It just carries for whatever distance. And whatever distance can be a fair range, because this sound can be anywhere from a whisper, real quiet, to a scream. I'm not going to scream into the mic. I'll spare you guys. But you can use all sorts of things for this. They give examples of a lion's roar or a beating of drums, all sorts of possibilities. And the sound is actually more flexible over time, because during the duration, you can actually make discrete sounds at different times. So you can actually basically make noises as you want for that minute. Now you can keep recasting it as you want, but you can make noises, and that is incredibly flexible in terms of what you can do with this. Now, I've sort of covered the combat uses. However, there are some additional sort of combat uses for sounds. For instance, you could potentially make enemies think that there are reinforcements coming. If you're being attacked by a group of rogues on the streets, you're walking down an alley and some bandits are trying to demand your coin purse. The sound of guards potentially running up might be enough to make them go, you know what, we don't want to be in this fight anymore, we're going to leave. That's tremendous, because any fight that you don't have to take everyone out is a fight you win. You win when they run away. You might not get their treasure, but it's still a fight you won, and you get to live another day. But there's all sorts of other non-combat uses, and this is where I really think Minor Illusion shines. It's a great spell. There's a lot of fun things you can do with this. One thing you can do is just communicate information. Comms have always been a critical thing in combat in terms of how you get messaging out. Before we had radios where we could coordinate soldiers, they would coordinate troops using things like flags and semaphore and other signals. Well, Minor Illusion is great for signaling. You can, have trumpet blasts, and you could have a variety of trumpet blasts to signal different things, all of which you can do with Minor Illusion. You can make different shapes, and you could put them up in the air, 30 feet up in the air, and communicate things to your soldiers that way. It's a great communication spell. It's also fantastic if you need to communicate visual information. For instance, if you are looking for a particular bad guy and you're asking around, well, you can use Minor Illusion to perhaps create a little bust of his face, or a painting, or a drawing. However, Minor Illusion doesn't give you any special powers of memory, so if you can't remember what he looks like, that might be a difficulty. This is a spell that is boosted by something like Keen Mind, and you can compare and contrast this with something like Druid's Wild Shape, where if you've seen a bear, you can turn into a bear, but you don't necessarily have to remember what the bear looks like. Minor Illusion it's coming from your memory, it's coming from your imagination, and so there is some potential for miscommunications or errors in that fashion. If you, for instance, have a familiar who you can send up to give you a view of the surrounding landscape, you could then use Minor Illusion to show your friends that with a map or a drawing or something like that, all of which is just fantastic for this. There's, in the most recent sort of Lawyers and Dragons, I was able to use Minor Illusion as a very effective distraction. Gimlet was in a lot of trouble, and Gimlet is he's a criminal wizard. But he was able to drop a smoke bomb so that nobody could see what he was doing, and then make footsteps leading away. And so once you're able to do stuff like that, you can fool people in various ways. If you need a guard to, let's say you've got a guard who's giving you grief and is causing you problems, well, you might want to draw them away. And there's all sorts of sounds that you could use. For instance, the sound of glass breaking. That guard is probably at this point going to run and check that out. Or maybe somebody in trouble not far away. If they think that you're potentially involved in something suspicious, they're probably going to go and check out that, that much more concerning noise and just kind of cut you a break. I do criminal defense work in actual practice, and I can tell you I've had cases where the police have abandoned one particular thing in order to pursue another. There was one case where my client was driving down the road like an absolute crazy person, and there was all sorts of reasons for that. We're not going to get too much into that. But the police officer noted that he was busy writing a ticket to another driver, and that he had to abandon writing that ticket because when he sees this person driving in a very dangerous fashion, it's like, okay, I got to deal with the more important thing. So this allows for a great deal of potential, especially if you're playing a character who is likely to get into trouble in various ways. Similarly, if you are a thief, one great use for this is that you can actually create a fake for something. When you steal a bracelet, you can minor illusion and leave that bracelet behind for a whole minute. That gives you a whole lot of getting away time, assuming nobody goes to touch it. But that allows for a lot of situations where you could take something right out from under people's noses and just walk away and wait for it to, sort of happen a minute later. This potentially can give you an alibi as well, because if people see the object you stole sitting there while, when you leave, clearly you're not the one who stole it because it was still there when you left, right? So this is another great use for this. You can create circumstances where you might possibly create bait. If there's something that's like the bracelet I mentioned before, if you're walking down the street and you see a gold bracelet just lying there, lots of people will go and check that out. And that might be for altruistic reasons. They want to find this and return it to its rightful owner. But a lot of people are going to think, hey, this is the greatest day ever. Look at what I just found. I'm rich now. So that allows you to set up all sorts of possibilities. If you're talking about something that's a less intelligent creature, then something like a side of beef might be fantastic. However, keep in mind, it doesn't make smell, it doesn't make sounds, it doesn't do any of that stuff. And so some creatures might be weirded out by this instead of attracted. A wolf that sees a side of beef that doesn't smell like anything might think that this is really strange. This might be something that sets it on edge rather than necessarily attracting it. So that's something else to consider. There's all sorts of possibilities for messing with people with this as well. One thing Gimlet has already done is you're talking to somebody, they're kind of getting on your nerves, so you just make a little sound by their ear. How much would that get on your nerves? And you can't, if the spell casting is happening behind you, you're not going to hear the spell casting necessarily. You may not know that a spell has been cast, and that is something that could just sort of, wear at you. If you really want to engage in some very heavy psychological warfare, this is a fantastic spell for it. Because imagine all of the possibilities of this. You get home and you see that, there's 2 of something that you had, and then you blink and it's back to 1. You're going to start to doubt your own sanity. If you start hearing voices that are happening, this is something that could really kind of put you off. And there's all sorts of other options for that. One thing that is another option is just using this as sound cover. If you are doing something where, let's say you need to break a window, you're going to have to break this window in order to break in. Well, now you can use minor illusion in order to cover that with maybe a loud barking dog, something that is an innocuous sound in the environment, but where people aren't going to necessarily hear as you smash that window. There's all sorts of possibilities there, and they're really potentially useful. If you want to, this also has great application for social circumstances. Let us say that you've got, the evil prince is giving a speech to a crowd of peasants. Well, you can actually shape the crowd of peasants' responses by using minor illusion. This is something that comedies have done with laugh tracks. They've shown that audiences think it's funnier if you play them other people laughing. We're social creatures. We tend to shape our responses on what we think people are doing around us. So if you have your person and every time they talk, there's cheering, then that makes them sound maybe a little bit more persuasive. And then when the other side is talking, maybe the crowd's not so keen on it. And that can actually shape how the crowd is thinking about this. It can be a tremendously beneficial effect. As mentioned, we've got that 30-foot limitation as for where we create the sort of origin points. But if you think about this in terms of sounds, well, a scream originating within 30 feet is going to be heard for a lot longer distance than that. Similarly, a visual image that appears within 30 feet might be visible from a lot further away. So all of these are potential ways that you can kind of push the edge on that. I really like this spell just for all of the things you can do with it, and in some cases you could get people into a lot of trouble with this. For instance, think of a cliff face, and you just make a little fence that is really nice to lean on. Lots of people would be inclined to walk up to that and lean on it just to look over this cliff. This is really bad if you're going to if you're going to pass through that fence as soon as you lean on it. Most people might not test it before they lean on it. If there's a chasm and it's got this convenient dangling rope midway through, somebody might leap for the rope and, whoops, sorry, passed right through. All of these are situations where you can potentially, so long as you've got things set up nicely, create a false sense of security and bait people into getting themselves into trouble that you can rely on and exploit. So I really love this spell. You can't expect this to be a spell that solves all of your problems. Your DM will eventually get tired if minor illusion is the sort of solution to everything. And a lot of the sort of great answers that people put up, like, hey, I'll hide behind this barrier and nothing will ever shoot me. Well, eventually the enemies are gonna clue in. So long as they've got more intelligence than a brick of cheese, they're eventually going to start, using their object interaction, which is basically free, to touch this thing and see through it. There are other ways to detect these other than interaction with it directly. One of them is you can use an action to make an intelligence check, investigation check against the spell saving throw. And if they succeed, then they can see through it. They can tell that it's an illusion. But that's also great in combat situations because it took an action to do that. And in most circumstances, so long as your sounds are not something that's really really unusual or jarring, most people aren't going to think, hey, this is totally an illusion. They're going to think something else. So I think it's fantastic. I can't begin to cover all of the uses for it. Maybe at some point I could do a video just listing off like 100 different uses. But I really think this is a great cantrip. It's one, as I said, I almost always take unless I've got a reason not to. And so I just wanted to share that with you guys, talk about it a little bit. And a lot of the videos out there really focus on the combat uses. I wanted to talk about sort of the role-playing uses for it. Just before I go, some other things that have just occurred to me as I've been talking. You can fake other people's voices with it. And there's all sorts of circumstances where that could be amazing. Think about you're knocking on a door late at night. Somebody says, "Who is it?" Well, if you can make that set, if you can answer as their friend, then maybe they open the door for you. And maybe they didn't want to because you're a bunch of murder hobos. And that's a really bad idea for them to open the door for you. That has solved this problem of having to potentially let people know as you battered the door or as you had to pick the lock. So it's a great spell, and I'll leave it there. Let me know in the comments below if you have any, if there's anything you've done with minor illusion that you thought was fantastic, or anything you think I've missed here. And if you have any questions, because I'm always trying to explain these things in a way that I think is going to be useful, and especially to people who might not have played a whole lot. So let me know if there's anything I missed, because it's really easy when you've been playing the game for literally decades to explain things and sort of skip steps that are important to somebody who's just starting out. So please let me know, and if so, then I'll try to answer those questions in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you guys next time.